The story of white women's cruelty to black slaves. Number 1. The facade of Southern belles. Behind the elegant facade of Southern belles, a hidden world of cruelty thrived. Beneath their gentle smiles, white women in the antebellum South often perpetuated brutal treatment of their slaves. In the privacy of their plantations, they wielded power with an iron fist. White mistresses maintained a veneer of propriety while subjecting their slaves to unspeakable horrors. These women, celebrated for their grace, hid their sadistic tendencies from the public eye. Their refined manners masked a deep-seated cruelty that knew no bounds. The dichotomy between their public persona and private actions was stark and horrifying. Their control over slaves extended to every aspect of life, ensuring complete domination. These women were meticulous in their cruelty, leaving no room for escape or respite. The elegance of their homes belied the terror that lurked within. In the absence of their husbands, they assumed full authority, often with a chilling zeal. The punishment for even minor infractions was swift and severe, administered with a cold detachment. White women often orchestrated and executed acts of violence, enjoying the power they held. They used psychological tactics to instill fear, manipulating their slaves' every thought and action. The facade of gentility was a calculated deception, concealing a heart of stone. Social gatherings and teas were interrupted by the screams of slaves being punished out of earshot. The slaves lived in constant dread, knowing that the slightest misstep could result in brutal retribution. White mistresses used their societal status to protect themselves from any repercussions. Their cruelty extended beyond physical punishment to emotional and psychological torment. They reveled in their ability to break the spirit of their slaves, viewing it as a display of power. Stories of their sadism circulated quietly among slaves, creating an atmosphere of perpetual fear. They took pleasure in the absolute control they wielded over the lives of their slaves. The image of the Southern belle as a paragon of virtue was a carefully crafted lie. Their treatment of slaves revealed a sinister darkness that contradicted their public image. The contrast between their outward charm and inner cruelty was jarring and unsettling. The genteel exterior served as a smokescreen for their depravity. They cultivated an environment of terror, ensuring that slaves were always on edge. The psychological scars left by their cruelty often lasted a lifetime. The Southern belle, so revered in society, was often a figure of nightmares for her slaves. Number 2. The instruments of torment. White mistresses devised an array of instruments to inflict pain on their slaves. The whip, a common tool of punishment, was wielded with merciless precision. Chains and shackles were used to restrain slaves, often for extended periods. Torture devices, designed to cause maximum pain, were a staple in many households. The lash of the whip left deep, lasting scars, both physical and emotional. White women often took perverse pleasure in the act of whipping, finding satisfaction in the sight of blood. They used hot irons to brand slaves, marking them as property in the most painful way possible. Forced to wear iron collars or masks, slaves endured unimaginable discomfort and humiliation. Punishments were often carried out in front of other slaves to instill fear and obedience. White mistresses invented new ways to torture their slaves, always seeking to exert total control. They forced slaves into stress positions, causing excruciating pain over long periods. Sleep deprivation was another tactic used to break the will of slaves. Starvation and malnutrition were commonplace, used as a method of punishment and control. Slaves were often forced to perform grueling, back-breaking labor with little to no rest. The threat of punishment loomed constantly, creating a climate of perpetual terror. White women often delighted in the creative cruelty they could inflict on their slaves. Psychological torture, such as separating families, was used to break the spirit of slaves. Slaves were often forced to witness the punishment of their loved ones, adding to their torment. The sound of the whip cracking became a symbol of fear and submission. White mistresses devised rituals of punishment that were as elaborate as they were brutal. They kept slaves in a constant state of fear, never knowing when the next punishment would come. Slaves were often punished for infractions they did not commit, reinforcing the sense of helplessness. The cruelty of white women knew no bounds, and their ingenuity in causing pain was terrifying. Slaves bore the physical marks of their tormentors' sadism, a testament to their suffering. The psychological scars, however, were often deeper and more enduring. White women reveled in the absolute control they had over their slaves' bodies and minds. The instruments of torment were not just tools of punishment, but symbols of domination. Number 3. The manipulation of fear. White mistresses used fear as a primary tool of control over their slaves. They were adept at creating an atmosphere of constant dread and anxiety. The mere presence of a white mistress could send slaves into a state of panic. They employed psychological tactics to keep slaves in a perpetual state of fear. The threat of punishment was always present, creating an environment of uncertainty. Slaves were often kept in isolation, increasing their sense of helplessness. White women used threats against loved ones to manipulate and control their slaves. They spread rumors of even worse punishments to keep slaves compliant. The unpredictability of their cruelty added to the atmosphere of fear. Slaves were conditioned to anticipate pain and suffering at any moment. White mistresses enjoyed the power they held over the emotional state of their slaves. They used fear to break the spirit of slaves, making them easier to control. The constant fear of punishment left slaves in a state of chronic stress. White women exploited the fear of the unknown, keeping slaves off balance. The manipulation of fear extended to every aspect of a slave's life. They used fear to isolate slaves from one another, preventing solidarity. White mistresses often feigned kindness, only to betray their slaves later. The psychological toll of living in fear was immense and lasting. White women used fear to maintain their authority and reinforce their superiority. The fear of punishment was a tool to ensure absolute obedience. Slaves lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, always anticipating the worst. The manipulation of fear was a calculated and deliberate strategy. White mistresses understood the power of fear and wielded it expertly. The fear of retribution kept slaves from attempting to escape or resist. White women often used the fear of death to maintain control over their slaves. The atmosphere of fear permeated every aspect of plantation life. Slaves were conditioned to respond to their mistresses' commands without question. The manipulation of fear created a sense of hopelessness and despair among slaves. White mistresses took pride in their ability to control their slaves through fear. The legacy of their manipulation of fear is a testament to the psychological horror of slavery. Number 4. The psychological torment. White mistresses employed psychological tactics to break the spirit of their slaves. They used isolation to create a sense of loneliness and abandonment. The denial of basic needs, such as food and water, was a common tactic. White women often forced slaves to perform humiliating tasks as a form of control. They used emotional abuse to undermine the self-worth of their slaves. Slaves were often subjected to verbal abuse, reinforcing their sense of inferiority. The constant surveillance of their actions created a feeling of paranoia. White mistresses manipulated relationships among slaves to create distrust and conflict. They used false promises of freedom or leniency to manipulate their slaves. The psychological impact of constant dehumanization was profound and lasting. White women often used gaslighting to make slaves doubt their own perceptions and memories. The denial of cultural practices and traditions was a form of psychological control. Slaves were often forced to renounce their identities and adopt the ways of their oppressors. White mistresses used psychological torture to ensure complete domination over their slaves. The constant threat of separation from loved ones was a powerful tool of control. Slaves were often forced to witness the punishment or humiliation of others. The psychological scars of slavery often lasted long after physical wounds had healed. White women used their slaves' vulnerabilities against them, exploiting their fears and weaknesses. The psychological torment inflicted by white mistresses was as devastating as physical abuse. Slaves were often kept in a state of emotional exhaustion, making resistance impossible. White women took pleasure in the psychological suffering of their slaves, seeing it as proof of their power. The constant dehumanization of slaves served to reinforce the white mistress's sense of superiority. The psychological torment inflicted by white mistresses was a deliberate strategy to maintain control and suppress rebellion. White women often employed tactics designed to isolate slaves from their support networks, deepening their sense of despair. slaves were frequently subjected to cruel games and manipulative scenarios, further eroding their mental well-being. The relentless emotional abuse inflicted by white mistresses was intended to break the slave's will and spirit. White women frequently used psychological manipulation to create a dependency on their approval and mercy. The mental anguish experienced by slaves was compounded by the constant uncertainty and fear for their future. The psychological torment endured by slaves under the control of white mistresses was a dark testament to the cruelty of slavery. Number 5. The legacy of cruelty. The legacy of cruelty inflicted by white mistresses left deep, enduring scars on generations of black families. The psychological and physical wounds inflicted during slavery had long-lasting effects on the descendants of those abused. The legacy of white women's cruelty contributed to a pervasive culture of fear and subjugation that persisted long after emancipation. The impact of their cruelty was reflected in the systemic inequalities and racial tensions that continued to affect black communities. The emotional trauma experienced by slaves often resulted in a generational legacy of mental health struggles. The brutality of white mistresses is remembered as a chilling chapter in the history of slavery, illustrating the depths of human cruelty. The fear and manipulation tactics used by white women left a legacy of distrust and psychological scars that impacted the social fabric of black communities. The historical accounts of their cruelty serve as a grim reminder of the inhumanity that characterized much of the slaveholding era. The emotional impact of their cruelty contributed to a legacy of resilience and resistance among black communities. The stories of suffering and endurance passed down through families are a testament to the strength and survival of enslaved individuals. The brutality inflicted by white mistresses has been documented in historical records and personal testimonies, providing a chilling insight into the horrors of slavery. The legacy of their cruelty is a painful reminder of the atrocities committed in the name of power and control. The continued struggle for racial justice and equality is, in part, a response to the enduring legacy of slavery's cruelties. The haunting memories of abuse and degradation underscore the importance of remembering and acknowledging this dark chapter in history. The legacy of cruelty has influenced cultural narratives and artistic expressions, reflecting the deep scars left by slavery. The stories of those who suffered under the reign of white mistresses continue to resonate as a call for historical reckoning and justice. The systemic nature of the cruelty endured has had far-reaching effects on societal structures and racial dynamics. The continuing impact of this legacy is evident in ongoing discussions about race, inequality, and reparations. The historical record of white mistresses' cruelty serves as a sobering reminder of the depths of human depravity. The effects of their actions are visible in the ongoing struggles faced by descendants of enslaved individuals. What are your thoughts on the hidden cruelties endured by slaves under white mistresses in the antebellum South? How do you think these historical injustices continue to affect us today? Leave a comment below and share your perspective. And that's it from this video. See you in the next one.